They say a museum is just a building full of dead things. I used to believe that. But that was before I started working at Blackwood Historical Museum. The night shift was supposed to be easy. Just me, a flashlight, and hours of silence. No crowds. No kids smudging the glass displays. No tourists asking the same questions over and over. Just a quiet walk through dimly lit halls, making sure everything was where it should be. I stepped through the main entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaking as they closed behind me. The air was cool, carrying the scent of polished wood and dust. Old, untouched dust, like the past itself had settled in the corners of this place. The grand chandelier above flickered slightly, its golden light barely cutting through the darkness of the main hall. I signed in at the security desk, flipping through the logbook. My co-worker, Mason, had already clocked out. He always left early, never staying a second longer than his shift required. A sticky note was left on the desk, scrawled in his usual messy handwriting. If you hear footsteps where there shouldn't be any, don't look back. Just run. I snorted, shaking my head. Mason had a weird sense of humor. He loved to mess with the new guards, trying to freak us out with ghost stories about the museum. I wasn't falling for it. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way down the first corridor. The exhibits loomed on either side. Ancient artifacts behind glass, mannequins dressed in historical clothing, rusted weapons from long-forgotten wars. Their shadows stretched unnaturally under the dim emergency lights. As I passed the Egyptian wing, I caught my reflection in the glass of a sarcophagus. My dark hair was pulled into a low ponytail, and my security badge hung from my belt. My own eyes stared back at me, but for a second, just a second, I swore I saw something else behind me. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight down the hallway. Nothing. Just silence. I exhaled, shaking off the unease. This place had a way of playing tricks on a mind. The way the air seemed too still, the way sound barely carried through the halls, as if the walls swallowed it whole. I continued my patrol, checking the locks on the display cases. Everything was normal. Everything was in its place. Still, Mason's note lingered in my mind. Footsteps where there shouldn't be any. Ridiculous. I adjusted my flashlight grip and kept walking. Behind me, somewhere deep in the museum, a soft footstep echoed. I froze. The sound came again. One step, then another. Slow, deliberate. I turned my head slightly, listening. The museum was supposed to be empty. And yet, someone, or something, was walking toward me. The museum is different at night. It's not the same place visitors see during the day, full of chatter and camera flashes. When the last person leaves and the doors lock behind them, it becomes something else, something hollow, something waiting. My boots clicked softly against the marble floor as I made my rounds. The dim overhead lights cast long, stretching shadows against the glass display cases. The air smelled of old paper and dust, thick with the scent of history. I walked through the Egyptian exhibit, glancing at the statues frozen in time. A golden mask stared back at me from behind a glass case, its empty eyes glinting under the museum lights. I had been working here for 3 months, but something about this place always put me on edge. Maybe it was the way everything stood still, like the artifact were listening. I pulled my radio from my belt, checking in, as usual. "North Wing, all clear," I said. A crackle of static. Then silence. That was strange. The response was usually instant. Maybe the reception was bad in this section. I shrugged it off and kept walking. Then I heard it. A footstep. Not mine. I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. It had come from behind me, somewhere near the entrance of the exhibit. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room. Nothing. The museum was empty. I knew it was. I had checked every door, locked every entrance. No one else was here. I exhaled, shaking my head. Maybe it was just an echo. The halls were big, and sound carried weirdly in old buildings like this. I continued my rounds, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. Then it happened again. This time, the sound was closer. A single step, then another. Slow, purposeful. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. "Hello." My voice sounded too loud in the silence. No answer. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room. The exhibits were still. The statues hadn't moved. The cases were locked. But something felt wrong. The air had changed, thicker, heavier, as if the museum itself was holding its breath. I checked my radio again. North Wing, checking in. Do you copy? The static returned, louder this time, hissing in my ear. Then, beneath it, something else, a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard and turned back toward the hallway. My shift wasn't over, and I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. But as I stepped forward, the footsteps followed. Closer. I didn't turn around. I kept walking, my pulse racing, my hands clenched in a fist. I told myself it was nothing. The museum was old. The floors creaked. The pipes groaned. There was a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone, and whatever was with me didn't want to be seen. I hate how quiet the museum gets at night. It's the kind of silence that plays tricks on your mind, making you hear things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there, and you just don't want to believe it. I walked through the main corridor, the dim overhead lights flickering softly. My boots echo against the marble floors as I pass by tall glass cases filled with ancient artifacts. The Egyptian exhibit is the worst. Something about the hollow eyes of the statues makes my skin prickle. I shake off the feeling and head to the security office. The monitors show the usual empty halls, except for the occasional flicker of static. Just an old system, I tell myself. Nothing to worry about. On the desk, I find a night log, a thick, leather-bound book with yellowing pages. I flip through it, skimming over notes from previous guards. Most of it is routine. Then I see a name I don't recognize. Tiago Laurent. It's underlined several times, as if someone wanted to make sure it wasn't forgotten. I frown and keep reading. The entry is dated 5 years ago. Final patrol of the night. Museum seems fine. No sign of Tiago Laurent. It's been 2 weeks since he disappeared. No leads. No forced entry. It's like he just vanished. A chill crawls down my spine. I've heard the name before. Tiago Laurent was the museum's curator, a man obsessed with history, especially the artifacts in this very building. I remember hearing a rumor when I first took this job, something about how he locked himself in the archives one night and never came out. The security team searched everywhere. No broken locks. No footprints. No sign of him. The museum claimed he resigned, but people whispered a different story. I run my fingers over the ink. The words smudged like someone pressed too hard. Something about the way it's written unsettles me. The entry doesn't end like the others. There's more, faint, almost invisible writing at the bottom of the page, scrawled in shaky handwriting. They don't let you leave. They only let you become. My breath catches in my throat. A soft click echoes behind me. I freeze. The office door is still open, but I swear I just heard it move. Slowly, I turn my head toward the hallway. The air feels heavy, thick like a storm is about to break. The security monitors flicker again, and for a split second, I see something in the reflection of the glass. A shadow standing at the far end of the Egyptian exhibit. Tall, still, watching. Then the screen goes black. A cold shiver runs through me. I swallow hard and reach for my radio. Static. Just static. My fingers tremble slightly as I flip back to the logbook. I don't know what I expect to find, but I scan the pages again, searching for any mention of Tiago. Something. Anything. Then I realize this is the only record of him. No hiring date. No resignation letter. No background information. Just a name. And a warning. The air in the room shifts, like someone exhaling just behind me. I don't turn around. I don't want to see what's there. The air in the museum had changed. It was subtle at first, like the way a room feels right before a thunderstorm. Charged, expectant. I felt it in my chest, and the way my breath came slower, heavier. I shook off the feeling and pressed forward, my flashlight sweeping over the glass cases. The Egyptian exhibit had always given me an odd feeling, but tonight was different. Something was wrong. I stopped. My eyes narrowed at one of the display cases. Inside was a golden amulet, the kind buried with pharaohs, resting on a red velvet cloth. But something wasn't right. My stomach clenched as I realized what it was. There were fingerprints on the inside of the glass. I took a slow step back, my pulse quickening. The cleaning crew had finished hours ago, and I was the only one here. I turned to check the next case, then another. More fingerprints. Some smudged, as if someone, or something, had been dragging their fingers down the glass from the inside. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears. I forced myself to move, to act normal. It was probably just a mistake. Maybe someone forgot to wipe the glass properly. That had to be it. But then I saw the doors. I had locked them. I was sure of it. Every entrance, every exit. I had checked them at the start of my shift. And yet, now, the heavy double doors at the far end of the room were slightly open, just enough to reveal a sliver of pure darkness beyond. My hands turned cold. I reached for my radio, but the moment I pressed the button, all I got was static. A low, whispering static that seemed to slither into my ears, crawling under my skin. Then, beneath the static, I heard it. A voice. At first, it was too soft to make out, like a breath against the receiver. Then it sharpened, the words stretching, distorting, as if the speaker was far away and getting closer. You shouldn't have stayed. I yanked the radio from my belt, staring at it like it had burned me. The voice, whoever it was not from security. I had worked here long enough to know every guard's voice, and this wasn't one of them. I turned, ready to leave the exhibit, when I noticed something else. The layout was wrong. I had worked here for months. I knew every hallway, every turn, but the door I had walked through just minutes ago was no longer there. In its place stood a solid wall of stone, carved with ancient symbols I had never seen before. My fingers tightened around my flashlight. This wasn't possible. The footsteps came again, soft but deliberate, coming from the far end of the exhibit. I took a step back, then another. I turned toward the only remaining exit, the slightly open doors leading into the darkness. I didn't want to go that way. Every instinct in me screamed, don't. But the footsteps behind me were getting closer and closer. My heart pounded as I pushed the doors open. Beyond them was nothing but blackness. I swallowed hard. Then, taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. I moved quickly, my boots tapping against the cold marble floor. The museum was dead silent, except for the sound I didn't want to hear. Footsteps. They weren't mine. They were slow at first, deliberate, keeping pace with me. Every time I stopped, they stopped too. I turned a corner, pressing my back against the wall, trying to steady my breath. My hand gripped the flashlight tighter. The security feed had gone static. My radio crackled with whispers, but I couldn't make out the words. It felt like someone was just behind me, their breath warm against my neck. But when I turned, there was nothing. I swallowed hard and pushed forward, heading for the Egyptian exhibit. If someone was messing with me, I needed proof. I needed to catch them on camera. As I entered, the air felt heavier. The room smelled of old paper, dust, and something faintly metallic. The statues stood tall in their glass cases, their eyes carved into cold, expressionless faces. But something was wrong. The sarcophagus in the center of the room was supposed to be sealed shut. Now, the lid was slightly ajar. A chill ran through me. The footsteps started again, closer this time. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the dimly lit hall, but there was no one there. Just empty corridors stretching into darkness. Then I heard it. A voice. Not from my radio. Not from the halls. From the walls themselves. You shouldn't have stayed. I gasped and stepped back, my heart hammering. The voice was deep, distorted, like someone speaking through a broken speaker. I forced myself to breathe. Who's there? My own voice sounded small in the massive, empty space. No answer. Just silence. I took another step back, and the display case beside me rattled. My flashlight flickered. The whisper returned, this time right by my ear. You shouldn't have stayed. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My back hit the sarcophagus, and my breath caught in my throat. Something moved in the reflection of the glass case. A shape. A figure. I turned slowly, feeling ice spread through my veins. There he was. Tiago Loran. Or at least, something that used to be him. His face was pale, stretched too thin, his eyes hollowed out like he had been drained of everything human. His mouth moved, but the words came from behind me, from beside me, from everywhere. You shouldn't have stayed. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hands. Stay back, I shouted, but my voice barely echoed. Tiago didn't move like a person. His body twitched in unnatural motions, like something was trying to remember how to be human, but had forgotten the details. His fingers curled, reaching. I ran. I didn't care where. I just had to get away. As I sprinted through the halls, the whispers followed. The footsteps no longer mimicked mine. They chased. fast, hungry. The museum was no longer just a place. It was alive. It wanted me to stay, and I was running out of time. The air in the museum had changed. It was thick now, pressing against my chest like invisible hands squeezing the breath out of me. I wanted to believe this was my mind playing tricks, that exhaustion was warping my senses. But the footsteps, they were real. I wasn't alone. I turned down the main corridor, moving quickly past towering glass cases filled with artifacts. My radio was dead, just static. The security cameras in the corners of the hall flickered, catching brief glimpses of something moving behind me. I didn't look back. The museum felt different now. The walls seemed narrower. The ceilings felt lower. I had walked these halls 100 times, but suddenly, they stretched into something unfamiliar. I reached the main entrance, but the doors that should have been there weren't. Just a long, dark hallway where they never should have been. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. I took a step back, heart pounding. The footsteps behind me stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and waiting. Then a voice. Low, raspy, and far too close. You shouldn't have stayed. Every muscle in my body locked up. It was him, Tiago Loran, the curator who vanished years ago. I didn't want to turn around, but my body betrayed me. I saw him, or what was left of him. He stood at the end of the hall, half hidden in the flickering light. His face, twisted, stretched, as if something had tried to pull him into another shape, but never finished the job. His mouth moved, but the voice came from somewhere else. From the walls, from the air, from behind me. I ran. The museum twisted around me, halls looping back where they shouldn't, doors leading to rooms that didn't exist. My boots slammed against the marble floor, but the footsteps behind me stayed close. No matter how fast I ran, they never faded. I reached the Egyptian exhibit. The towering statues of long-forgotten gods loomed over me. For a moment, I thought I saw one of them move. I pushed forward, weaving through the displays, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. Then I saw it, an emergency exit. The green sign flickered above it, promising escape. I didn't slow down. I lunged for the door, fingers curling around the handle. But before I could pull it open, the footsteps stopped. So did the whispers. The silence was worse. I didn't want to turn. Every part of me screamed not to. But I could feel it. Something was right behind me. A breath, cold and slow. A voice, barely a whisper. It only needs you to see it. The lights flickered out. The air grew thick as I bolted down the hall, my footsteps echoing off the cold marble floors. My breath was shallow, each inhalation a desperate gasp. The sound of those footsteps behind me, distant at first but now so close, was the only thing I could hear. It was like they were chasing me, always just a step behind, relentless, unyielding. Every time I turned a corner, the hallway stretched farther than it should have, twisting, distorting into shapes I couldn't quite grasp. The museum was no longer a place of walls and doors. It was a maze, an endless loop that kept me inside. I didn't dare look back, even though every inch of me screamed to see if he was there, if Tiago, that thing, was still following. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the sickening sound of the footsteps. Heavy, purposeful. The echo rattled my bones. They were closer, much closer. I reached the end of a corridor and saw it. The exit, the final door. My heart thundered against my ribs. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running. I hadn't even dared to look back once. Every fiber of my being told me to keep moving forward, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt the unmistakable pull of something. A tugging sensation in the air. It whispered a warning. A command, maybe. My legs faltered for just a second. Don't look back. I heard it clear as day. A voice that wasn't mine, low and guttural. It felt like a warning, but I didn't have the luxury of stopping to understand it. The door was within reach, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence around me felt unnatural, oppressive. The footsteps behind me had stopped. Why? I didn't pause. I pushed open the heavy door, the handle cold and slick beneath my palm. It creaked like an old floorboard, protesting the intrusion, but I didn't care. I stepped through, into the dark. The night air was damp, cold against my skin. I was outside, or I should have been. But as I took a breath, I realized something was off. I wasn't outside. I turned to the door I just opened. The room beyond was exactly the same as the one I'd just fled. The walls were lined with those cursed displays, the ancient artifacts, the brittle wood of a desk that wasn't even supposed to be here. I froze. The exit was a lie. It was always a lie. I could feel him then, Tiago. That thing, standing somewhere just beyond the darkness. The weight of his presence pressing against me. But I refused to turn. I couldn't. I remembered the warning. Don't look back. I took another step back, my shoes scraping against the floor. The air around me thickened with every movement, the walls pressing in like they were alive, wanting to swallow me whole. But I had no choice. There was nowhere left to run. My body trembled. Sweat slicked my forehead, and I could feel the panic creeping back up my throat, threatening to drown me. I had to face it. My feet took me forward again, this time slower, more cautious. The footsteps didn't follow me anymore, but the silence was just as deafening. The museum was waiting. The whole damn thing was waiting for me. The question was, what for? I reached the next room and halted, staring at the darkness. The artifacts lined the walls, but they were different now. Older than they should be. The paintings of people I didn't recognize seemed to watch me, their eyes heavy, their expressions frozen in time. A broken clock sat on the shelf, its hands still, but its tick-tock echoed like a heartbeat in my ears. Then I saw it. Tiago. He was standing at the far end of the room. His figure was unnaturally still, his back to me. But I could feel him, the weight of his gaze, the hunger in the air. His body was shrouded in shadow, but there was something about him that was wrong. His shoulders were too broad, his limbs too long, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. The air felt colder as I stared at him. He was looking at something I couldn't see. Slowly his head turned. His face. God, his face. It wasn't just pale. It was wrong. Distorted. Like he was caught between two worlds. Flesh and shadow. Human and something else. His lips pulled into a twisted grin, but his eyes, they didn't look at me. They looked through me, like I wasn't even there. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but the words lodged in my throat, stuck in fear and understanding. Tiago wasn't the man he had been. He wasn't even human anymore. He was something else, something that lived in the spaces between the walls. The whisper came again, clearer this time. You shouldn't have stayed. I wanted to run, but the door behind me was gone. The hallway stretched before me, endless, like a dark void that was pulling me deeper in. I couldn't turn. I couldn't look back. But my body betrayed me. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head, just enough to glimpse the darkness that had been chasing me. I could hear him now, his steps, right behind me. But they were wrong. They sounded like something scraping, something dragging itself along the floor. I tried to scream, but my mouth was dry. Nothing came out. A soft breath of air brushed my neck. And that's when I knew. I was already a part of the museum. I walked into the security office at Blackwood Historical Museum with the usual unease that came with every shift. The silence was thicker tonight, somehow heavier. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt safe. It felt like the kind of quiet that waits for something to happen. The hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead seemed to echo through the empty halls, as if they too were listening. The guard I replaced, his name was Rick, had given me a weird look when I showed up. Don't stay too long. And if you hear footsteps, don't look back, he said, half joking, half serious. I laughed it off, trying to be cool, try to prove that I wasn't the kind of person who bought into ghost stories. After all, I was here for a paycheck, not some bedtime horror. But that look in Rick's eyes stayed with me as I made my way to the security room. He had left in such a hurry earlier, almost like he was relieved to escape the building. Sitting at the desk, I switched on the monitors, and there it was, the sprawling layout of the museum. The Egyptian exhibit, the ancient weapons room, the Victorian gallery, all bathed in that same eerie, flickering glow. It was all so still, too still. As I scanned the screens, a cold chill crawled up my spine. I glanced over at the empty hallway visible through the window. For a second, I thought I saw something move at the far end of the corridor. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. My heartbeat quickened, but I tried to ignore it. There were no cameras down that hall, so it was just my imagination, right? I turned my attention back to the security footage, tapping through the rooms. That's when I heard it, a faint click-click-click like the sound of shoes on hard floors, echoing from the Egyptian exhibit. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the sound that got to me. It was the silence that followed it. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one there. No one at all. I pushed the button, checked the intercom, ready to call for Rick or someone, but then the sound came again, closer this time. Click, 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 click. I froze. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly feeling very small in this vast, dark building. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick. The footsteps continued, but there was no one in sight. No one in the hallway. No one in the room. I reached for the radio, but it buzzed to life in my hand, crackling with static. I heard something through the noise, something I couldn't quite understand, but it sent a chill down my spine. It was a voice, distorted, warped. If you hear footsteps, don't look back. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I almost dropped the radio. The voice wasn't Rick's or anyone else I recognized. It was wrong. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was just tired, if maybe I had been working too long, but when I looked at the monitor again, the shadows were different. The rooms didn't look the same anymore. Familiar displays now seemed to shimmer at the edges, like they were fading in and out of reality. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway of the Egyptian exhibit. It was hard to make out at first, but as it stepped forward into the dim light, I felt my breath catch. The figure looked wrong, like it was wearing another person's skin. It was someone I knew. It was Rick. But it wasn't Rick. Not really. His face was stretched and contorted, his eyes wide and empty, as if the weight of something else entirely had taken over. I couldn't look away. I shouldn't have looked away. And then the voice came again, a soft whisper cutting through the static, louder this time. It's too late for you now. I shoved the radio down, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't leave the room. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place. For a moment, all I could hear was the soft click, click, click of footsteps moving closer, circling me. My eyes flicked back to the monitor, and the hallway outside the security room was empty again, except for one detail. A figure standing just outside the door. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew who it was. Gabby. I didn't know how, but somehow I could tell. The figure's outline, her shadow, her posture, was unmistakable. The same guard who had been here for her shift, the one who never left. And in that moment, as I watched her standing just beyond the door, my stomach twisted. I knew I was never going to leave. The camera feed blinked out for a split second, and when it returned, Gabby wasn't standing in the hallway anymore. But I knew she was still here. I knew she was already part of the museum. The footsteps started again, closer this time, and I had no choice but to follow the warning I had heard. Don't look back. But there was no escaping now. The museum had claimed me, and soon, someone else would be sitting in this chair, watching the cameras, and they would hear the same voice through the static. If you hear footsteps, don't look back. But by then, it would be too late.